Good evening, everyone, and thank you all for being part of our World Bioethics Day program. What can Nazi medicine teach us about our current public health crises? As we've had international interest in this program, we are recording it for educational purposes. Tonight's event is being co-sponsored by the Center for Human Dignity in Bioethics, Health, and the Holocaust at Misericordia University and the Medical and Health Humanities program at MU, along with the Department of Bioethics and the Holocaust of the UNESCO Chair of Bioethics and the Maimonides Institute for Medicine Ethics and the Holocaust. This program has been made possible in part by the National Endowment for the Humanities CARES Grant, Humanities in the Time of COVID-19, Fostering Community Dialogue. Any views, findings, conclusions, or recommendations expressed in this panel discussion do not necessarily represent those of the National Endowment for the Humanities. We have a wonderful event lined up for this evening, and I don't want to take up any more of your time other than to provide one final bit of housekeeping information. While we do have a packed program tonight, if you have any questions, please feel free to enter them in the chat, and we will do our best to pose them to the panelists at the end of the discussion if time permits. We are incredibly honored to have as our special guest this evening, Professor Dr. Russell D'Souza, who is the head and chair of the Asia Pacific Division, the director of the Department of Education, and the head of the International Program of the UNESCO Chair in Bioethics. Dr. D'Souza has been an integral part of the successful implementation of the annual World Bioethics Day programs, as well as the creation of a series of international webinars examining bioethics in the wake of COVID-19. He has developed an international certificate course on the principles of bioethics and human rights in medical and health science education that is offered to students from many different countries as part of his educational endeavors. Dr. D'Souza's accomplishments are far too numerous to list in the short amount of time we have tonight. Suffice it to say, he is one of the leaders in the field of international bioethics education and has dedicated his career to sharing his immense knowledge and passion with students from all over the world. It is my great pleasure to introduce Professor Dr. Russell D'Souza, who will give the opening remarks for this evening's World Bioethics Day event.
Thank you, Stacy, and to the co-presenters, Ira and Michael, who have on several occasions been part of our program, and also from the UNESCO chair. I'm delighted to be here. I'm talking to you from Melbourne, Australia, where, of course, we've had the whole of yesterday was a number of events on the World Bioethics Day. For me, finished very late because of Asia being behind. But I'm delighted to be here, and in particular, for a very good reason. You see, the World Bioethics Day has focused every year on one of the principles of the Universal Declaration on Bioethics and Human Rights. And this year, or at least it was decided last year, that this year the focus is to be on benefits and harm. Now, that's Article 4 of the Universal Declaration. But important to all this is that all these articles come from or based on the foundation of Article 3 that enshrines human dignity and human rights. And you see, all the others flowing on, we have, and the good thing of the Universal Declaration, it goes beyond our 4 principles that we're used to generally in the medical ethics point, because we go further than that to not all based on dignity, but going further to a number of areas, including access, equality, equity, stigma, discrimination, social responsibility, environment, and protecting for the future generation. So this is the expanded view. Now, I have great interest in what is there today. Professor Stacy Gallin, as the head of the unit, has given us, rather than benefits and harm, she has we have gone into a very important area. But remember that we are in the context of the COVID. When we decided to have this TAB theme, we didn't know about the COVID, right? But now we have COVID, and the theme for your unit on looking at the Nazi medicine and what implications that it has to when we correlate that with what we are going through today, I think it's absolutely relevant, and it does link to benefits and harm, and ultimately to human dignity and human rights. I am also I have a role on the World Medical Association for the and attend the meeting of what's called the Confederation of the Medical Associations of Asia and Oceania on Saturday. And one of the things that when I saw your the program today, I was looking at what the presidents or the heads of these some of the medical associations and who relate very much to what you were our theme today. An example is Hong Kong, and for that matter Thailand. They have expressed how in the realm of public health and using the Public Health Act, they are being the dissent, the freedom, the democratic requirements that the population is asking for is being stifled, but all in the name of very effective and necessary COVID management. And this is the type of thing that we are talking. And I think I just 2 days ago, I was on a television interview with the Russian, one of the Russian TV, asking about asking about a question that we in Australia have had in Victoria, which of course has had again a very severe, strict lockdown on the grounds of the COVID. And of course, there are questions, there are dissent to this lockdown, and you know the reasons, and including a parliamentary being called in to extend the emergency and disaster rule of the parliament to where parliamentary scrutiny is to some of these things are devoid, and they were asked to extend for 18 months. So all these things have led to issues, and people here too are, even in a wonderful free country like Australia, there are questions being asked and by the citizens and of the country. So this is an important issue, and I think today's program with excellent panelists here will be able to offer a great understanding and insight, particularly of importance because you're referring to the Nazi medicine. And I've been talking about an important issue. Our bioethics in the Western world or the developed world stems from the atrocities of the Nazi, the war, the Second World War, and the atrocities that came up with the Nuremberg the trial and so forth, and the Helsinki Declaration. And what we've really done in the last many years, bioethics has focused from this onto a very important area of pretty much into autonomy, into freedom, into informed consent, into protection of research participants and consent for all these. But what we've learned from the pandemic so far is an important area that we have not focused that much on is justice, distributive justice. And where we see in this pandemic, the whole issue, a lot of issues have come around this issue of transparency, of access, of sharing, of benefits and burdens. All these areas are, I'm sure, that today's today's discussion is going to bring great insight into this whole issue. So with this, I want to congratulate Professor Stacy Gallin, who is an important part of not only of the UNESCO program, but also of the International Education Department, which is an international with focuses in the whole world. I want to congratulate you for so aptly picking this theme for today in the current situation, which I think is really required, very much required. And I want also to congratulate Professor Ira Bedzow and also the Professor Michael Robertson, who are excellent. I've heard them speak, and they have been part of the UNESCO Chairs panel, international panel. And I wish you all the best. Congratulations, and I look forward to listening to the progress of this World Bioethics Day program at your center. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. D'Souza, not only for your remarks, but also for taking the time out of what I know is your incredibly busy schedule. I'm not, how many World Bioethics Day events you've spoken at, I can't even imagine. So we really, really appreciate you taking the time to be here with us this evening. I now have the pleasure of introducing our two panelists for this evening, who will be discussing what Nazi medicine can teach us about the current public health crises. Michael Robertson is a consultant psychiatrist, visiting professorial fellow at the Sydney Jewish Museum, and clinical associate professor in the School of Public Health at the University of Sydney, where he teaches mental health ethics, occupational mental health, and the mental health consequences of climate change. He also lectures in the Holocaust Studies program at the University of Sydney. His clinical area of interest is complex trauma and forensic psychiatry. He has published and presented internationally on multiple areas related to psychiatry and medical criminality in the National Socialist period in Europe. He is co-author of this wonderful book, The First Into the Dark, The Nazi Persecution of the Disabled, published in 2019 by UTS ePress. We have a link which we will share with you, where you can access the ebook, audiobook, and links to Amazon and other retailers. It's a really, really fascinating book. I highly recommend it. And I know Ira just read it, and I know he highly recommends it as well. Ira Bedzow, PhD, is Associate Professor of Medicine, UNESCO Chair in Bioethics, and Director of the Biomedical Ethics and Humanities Program at New York Medical College. He is also Senior Scholar of the Aspen Center for Social Values, a contributor at the Miriam Institute, and a regular contributor in Forbes for their Leadership, Diversity, and Inclusion section. Dr. Bedzow's interests relate to understanding the ethical implications of biotechnology and healthcare policy, as well as how organizations can create an ethical culture through values-driven leadership. When it comes to ethical leadership, he tries to show that making a values-driven decision and implementing it effectively consists of different skills and face different challenges. Understanding the difference between asking what to do and how can I act on my values successfully is key to leadership and organizational success. Thank you both for being with us tonight. Michael was actually supposed to be with us last spring, but unfortunately, COVID got in the way of that. So we are very, very happy that we were able to have him here tonight, even if it is virtually from his home in Sydney. So Michael, this book that we were just talking about before that you recently published on Nazi persecution of the sick and disabled, what were the main themes of the book that can help us understand our current bioethical challenges?
Well, thank you, Stacy, and good evening to everybody. The reason that we wrote the book, and it extended from a program of research looking at the relationship between the medical profession and the state. And we thought that we would start with the Nazi period and the, I suppose, revelations of the doctor's trial and the Nuremberg trials of other perpetrators. What we discovered was that there was a part of Nazi criminality or Nazi victimology that had been underrepresented in the English language literature. It had been well represented in the German language literature, and that was the persecution of the sick and the disabled. And the further we research went into this aspect of that history, the more important it seemed that the lessons that period became. What we wanted to do was to re-narrate the history using historical narratives or biographical narratives to try and situate it. So the main, I suppose, figure in the book, a young girl called Elvira Hempel, I suppose tried to function as much as, say, as an Anne Frank might function when you're narrating the history of the Shoah. And what we wanted to do was re-narrate the history and then try to unpack the significance of that period and what it means for contemporary bioethics, and looking at areas like reproductive rights, disability rights, relationship between professions and the state. And without trying to sort of say, well, avoid that spurious analogy of, well, this is what the Nazis did, and I know this will come up in the conversation this evening. What we're trying to try and do is say, well, what were the themes that the profession and the state and the community, I suppose, what were the sort of values that they were operating under, and how do we share those values contemporarily, and how does this sort of look now? How does ableism look in the Nazi period, and how does that compare to how ableism or ageism or racism looks now? So that was the sort of the main thrust of why we wrote the book.
Thank you very much for that brief description of the book. I know one of the topics that you discuss in some amount of detail in your book is biopower. And I was just wondering if you could take a few minutes to discuss the topic of biopower, what it means in terms kind of both history and Nazi medicine, and also what it means for our current issues today that we're facing.
Yes, well, firstly, biopower sounds like a detergent, and it's otherwise known as biopolitics, but biopower is, I suppose, a tidier and more recognizable form. It's an idea that came out of the later writings of the French post-structuralist philosopher Michel Foucault, looking at the operation of the modern state and how the modern state exercised power over the community. And what it appears in his History of Sexuality and some other essays and teachings. And what Foucault argues is that one of the means by which the government or the state, through the practices of government, exerts control over the population is through control of biology. Foucault wrote a lot about, say, reproductive rights, who's allowed to reproduce, who is able to access assisted fertility, who was, in the case of, say, the Nazi example, subject to involuntary sterilization. And subsequent writers have taken biopower as a theme, not just in bioethics, but also in political science and so on, to look at how the state controls the population through biopower, the control of biology. So beyond reproductive rights, there would be questions of distribution of various social goods. Again, coming back to the Nazi example, who got fed, who starved to death, who is able to access certain types of healthcare, the enforcement of things like vaccinations, and as we're seeing right now, quarantines or restrictions of liberty in the context of a emergency of biology. Other writers, such as Giorgio Agamben, looked at biopower and how it applied to genocide, looking at genocide as being the ultimate expression of biopower, the literal elimination of a biological subgroup. Other more recent writers have written about how the market operates under a biopower or biopolitical structure. So, for example, you could look at how the food industry might control what dictates nutrition, what kind of science is it? Suddenly we're not allowed to eat fat, then we're not allowed to eat sugar, and we should be fasting or we shouldn't be fasting. So all these kinds of technologies and practices are sort of comported through market power structures now. So I think looking at how biopower operated in the Nazi regime and how it operates now is very interesting. And what we argue in the book is we look at the work of the historian Robert Proctor, who wrote a lot about Nazi public health, or Volksgesundheit, as they called it. The Nazis traded in biological metaphors and used it to justify not just the persecution and elimination, shall we say, of the genetic underclass or people with disabilities, but later other racial groups. Proctor noted that the Nazis were obsessed with eliminating cancer and were, I suppose, leading in terms of public health research and the effects of cigarette smoking. They were very active in promoting safe workplaces, promoting appropriate dietary practices, and so on. Now, ultimately, that was to try and enhance the war-making capability of the German people. But what we see is that many of the things that were done in the interests of public health to improve the vitality and productivity of the community, we would see as almost like natural assumptions now. But you have to situate those activities of public health next to eliminated genocide of racial or genetic undesirables. So what we want to try and understand is how the state, through biopower, controls the population, how it looks now, and how it can go horribly wrong in circumstances of political or economic extremism, which ultimately, if you think of Weimar Germany as a failed state and the Nazi regime as the extension of that failed state, how far off are we seeing that kind of eventuality repeat?
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. And when you talk about biopower and the way in which it sounds, right, this like very strong biopower, immediately what comes to mind for me is the fact that in Nazi Germany, they were referred to as the biological state. And again, it was this idea of this very strong approach that combines politics and medicine, whether you want to say the politicization of medicine, the medicalization of politics. Now, I think that it's not really something that you can separate because neither politics nor medicine occurs in a vacuum. Everything occurs in the context of the culture and the society that we live in. And Robert Proctor actually has a wonderful quote, I'm going to paraphrase it, that says things can happen in times of war that would not otherwise be acceptable in times of peace. And I think that, again, when you're talking about this unity between politics and medicine, the idea of biopower, the idea of politics kind of taking over certain things having to do with public policy, it's really something that we need to think about. So Dr. Bedzow, do you think that you could kind of shed some light on your thoughts regarding the idea of biopower or the biological state, how it was used in Nazi Germany and how it is currently being used?
Sure. I would love to. I'm going to answer the question in a way that also speaks to what I got out of Michael Robertson's book as well. So one of the themes that I saw in Michael Robertson's book, which lays out very much in the narrative as much as in the explicit ethical section in the second half of the book, which speaks to how Nazi Germany can look as a lesson for today and how biopower plays today, is really looking at the consequences or the implications of what is the moral grounding of the medical profession when the medical profession becomes a profession, when it professionalizes, as opposed to having individual doctors, but when you see it as a community unto itself, as some sort of professional autonomy. So in the ethical literature, you see that there's two different types of views on where the ethical grounding of medicine lies. One is where the medical profession is a community unto itself, and the ethos is internal to it in the respect of it's grounded in the goals of medicine and in the values of medicine. The other way of looking at it is it's not that, oh, well, let me go back to that. So then when medical professionals or the profession of medicine interacts with other communities in society, then even when values may conflict or there might be tension between them, it's still a give and take and a negotiation between different groups in order to come to a fluid or a more flexible view of what decisions could be made based on authority and personal autonomy. The other view, and again, that might have implications that are negative as well, but there is a grounding there that's independent of power. Another view is the authority or the ethics of the medical profession. You should see the medical profession not as a community unto itself, but as a community that plays a role within the state. So just as the medical profession plays a certain role that has state values and state goals, like the legal profession or government or the military and so forth, they serve a purpose of the greater society. But what happens then is that the medical profession and its values and its goals are not necessarily the ethical grounding. It's how the profession can serve the values and the goals of the state. And then the fear that happens, or what I saw through Michael Robertson's book, is medical authority is very much then becomes intimately tied to state power when the interests of states and the medical profession become more intimately aligned. When that happens, and you have a big difficulty or a big problem in terms of using medicine to serve state interests as opposed to societal goals. And when state interests are in conflict with greater societal goals, you can come to problems of biopower that are very deleterious and detrimental. So one of the things that we can really look at in terms of biopowers is the medical profession able to be a conduit or a component of civil society that can push back when the state goes, for lack of a better term, off the rails? Or does it become a way of supporting or reinforcing the power of the state because now the language and the authority of the medical profession now bolsters state power? And that is something I do think that we see today, both in terms of the medicalization of many social issues and the use of medicine, health professionals, and scientists in conjunction with the state in making policy decisions that are not simply medical, but very much social and civil as well.
Michael, I see you nodding your head there, so I'm wondering if there's anything that you want to add in response.
Oh, I think Ira's point is extremely well made. I think what we need to focus on in our current situation is that we are at a point of extremity, both political extremity, and that predates the epidemic, which has served to essentially cast a light on these the sort of extremity, this moment that we're in. In New South Wales, a state in Australia, and when the initial restrictions were announced, there was this sort of image of the Premier of the state standing next to the Chief Medical Officer, a doctor, and a police officer. So you had this rather, I think, discomforting juxtaposition of, you know, the power of coercion and the law being enabled by medical advice. And I think we've seen this play out, and how medical figures in various countries have assumed a certain prominence in public discourse, and how medicine comports itself as, I suppose, the executive in times like this. Foucault wrote about used the term dispositif, which translates into sort of like a mechanism. And what he was writing about was the way in which the state might use a biological emergency, such as this one. A colleague of mine at Sydney Health Ethics wrote about this in terms of the so-called obesity epidemic. And what happens with the dispositif is that the state uses that as a pretext to intervene. And what we're seeing here is that the biological emergency is being yoked to the economic emergency, and by extension, the political emergency. And all of a sudden, you see biology or biopower as a wedge into a process of social change. And we're seeing, certainly in Australia, that we had initially a sort of consensus view between the federal and state governments, often of different political stripes. But as time's gone on and opportunities have risen, these political leaders have reverted to type and used the opportunity to try and leverage change that they have waited to leverage, whether it be defunding the university sector, whether it refers to differential priorities in terms of who gets help, who doesn't get help. Obviously, we talk about the pink recession and various groups that are losing out with aid. And so I think what we're seeing, and certainly as Ira was pointing out, that the medical profession as an executive, particularly if you use the methodology of biopower to understand how the state operates, often gets drafted into or conscripted into areas outside of medicine. And that becomes very, very sticky territory ethically. And I think that's why looking again at the Nazi period and how the medical profession, which becomes empowered by the Nazi regime because it trades in biological metaphors, and as Martin Bormann said, it is applied biology. I think these are the kind of very unsettling, I suppose, parallels we've got to examine in our current situation.
Yeah, I mean, I would even add, and this is just a great thread to pull, that when the state is overly coercive or there's great trust in the state, you have a correlative of great trust in the authority of the medical profession. However, when there's great political instability, that also spills over into great instability and lack of trust in public health leaders and medical professionals. So because authority is now tied to power, when power is weakened, the authority is weakened to the point where you see an increase in people who won't even trust, forget public health measures, scientific data, because they think the scientific data is tainted by a politicization. That has longer term consequences than simply just the power that the medical profession now has.
I think, sorry, if I just comment, I mean, I think traditionally medicine or the medical profession has a hegemonic status in the community, and has done for many years, but there has been, I suppose, a revisitation of this idea of value-free science. We saw it in, the, I suppose, negotiability of climate change and the science of climate change, which continues to be, I mean, it's obviously fallen a little bit away in our current state, but this idea that science is an inviolable, immutable, and unquestionable truth is suddenly up for grabs. And I think that's not a new problem in the philosophy of science, but it's something that's become extremely divisive. And it has become as much a cultural process as it has been a political process. This idea, the simple kind of, not that there aren't that many anti-vaxxers, but the question, when I was going through medical school in the 1980s, there were just certain things you said, well, that's how it is. It's a scientific method outlines, it's our way of approximating the truth. You challenge this at your peril. But with that comes an empowerment of the scientific profession, the various other agencies of medical profession, and various other institutions in the state that suddenly are not, they're being questioned and challenged because of the sort of diversity of the challenges that we face now.
Michael, that brings up an excellent point. When we talk about value-free science or medicine, whether or not that's something that actually exists, and earlier you asked a question where you were talking about medicine as the executive. Right. And Iris, you as well, the power that medicine has. The question that I have that really relates to something, I think a theme that we saw in Nazi Germany is, who determines those values? Because if medicine has this power over society to determine and to shape the narrative and shape the values and shape the public policy, and we're saying, that sometimes these aren't necessarily these absolute truths that we were led to believe. When you have someone determining, kind of almost like a Wizard of Oz situation where it's behind the curtain determining these values, you think about the relative valuation of life that we saw in Nazi Germany, decisions being made about who was considered fit and who was considered unfit, that wasn't necessarily based on any type of objective, accurate medical science or facts or data. But was really, coming in with this large political agenda behind it. So, the question is, who determines these values and how does that impact the relative valuation of life? And particularly as we're seeing it right now with COVID-19 and, the way in which we're dealing with the frameworks and the guidelines for allocating scarce resources, older life, or people that have disabilities, comorbidities, things like that. What are your feelings on that? I guess I'll go to Ira first.
Well, I really want to hear what Michael has to say, but I'd be really careful when we talk about who determines values, because I think we have to talk about what values. And I don't mean whose values, I really mean what values here, because there are epistemological values that apply to science in terms of how to interpret empirical data. Do we want to be reductionist? Do we want to take the simplest explanation of cause and effect? How do we want to look at falsifiability? Those are views of how to understand the data as facts. Then there are the social values in terms of, once we understand what those facts are, even if they're tied to epistemological values, what do we want to do with them? And what biases are we creeping in terms of understanding, well, this science justifies or supports certain social positions or public positions we're willing to take. The scientific community determines the epistemological values, I mean, to a state, which may or may not be accepted outside of science. I mean, we have this whole debate between scientism versus other types of interpretive schemata. But the social aspect of how science is used based on what values, and just so we were very clear, medicine is really that intersection between science and social, because it isn't applying science to a medical or to a social good, which is health and life. That becomes a very much more complicated question, which I would love to hear what Michael has to say before I say anything.
Well, no pressure. Look, we begin the second half of our book, our discussion, quoting Leo Alexander, who was the advisor to the prosecution of the doctor's trial. And Alexander makes a very simple observation: is that the initial misstep that leads to mass murder is the permissibility of a relative valuation of life, that some lives are less worthy or less deserving than others. And from that initial step comes mass sterilization, and then the murder of the infant Gerhard Kretschmer, and then the implementation of the T4 program, then the decentralized euthanasia program, and so on. The question about who determines values, I think, is a very interesting one. Now, in the crime that we now know as the Krankenmord, the murder of the sick, the sort of this persecution of the sick and the disabled by the Nazi regime, the metric of who lived or died, apart from Jewish patients who were murdered regardless, was productivity, your economic value to the state, and therefore your ability to contribute to the war-making capacity in the case of the Nazi regime, or, you know, I suppose more contemporary, your ability to contribute to the economic good. And I think what we're seeing increasingly is the sort of, I suppose, gradualism of that value reappearing in our public discourse. So to give you some sense, in Australia, in the middle of the last decade, we implemented a publicly funded national disability insurance scheme, which enabled people for the first time to access social goods, whether it be access to various treatments, social supports, suitable employment, and so on. And as recently as the last 2 years, the federal minister for disability referred to the, quote, burden, unquote, of the NDIS, the financial burden of that. So the implication of that language is that these people cost us money. And I think, without, again, indulging a simplistic metaphor, that kind of idea of placing the cost of caring for somebody who is differently abled or older or less capable is the initial stages of, say, the Nazi propaganda, anti-disability propaganda, to manufacture consent for the elimination of this group. So values are, I think, handed down or determined by head office, but I think increasingly there are other kind of institutional and professional values that come to play. We write a little bit in the book, so my co-author Edwina Light and Astrid Lay, who come from different disciplinary perspectives, looked at, as dispassionately as they can, say that the psychiatric profession in Germany and how its values were determined. Now, prior to the assumption of power by Hitler, there were two schools of thought in German psychiatry, one of which was that mental illness was ultimately a biological phenomenon, a brain disease, and that is very much associated with the legacy of Emil Kraepelin. The other school of thought that begins with Freud and his descendants, his intellectual descendants, is that this is much more complex. It's more to do with psychology and psychodynamics. And so this dichotomy was for a time healthy. However, with the emergence of this virulent anti-Semitism with the Nazi regime, the so-called Jewish science of psychoanalysis is ejected. And so Freud and many of his disciples sense what's happening, leave Germany at the time, and the so-called Jewish science is then pushed away. Jeffrey Cox writes a lot about this in his book on Nazi psychotherapy. And so this dichotomy in the psychiatric profession between biology and psychology continues today. And in fact, in the 1990s, the first President Bush declared the decade of the brain, in which there was this promise that neurological science and progress in molecular genetics would give us the answers and give us the cures. So recasting mental illness as a form of biological inferiority that needed to be corrected. And that I suppose that paradigm continues, and then I think is bought into by the pharmaceutical industry and other aspects of the market that seek to profit from this idea that mental illness or human distress in any form is a form of biological dysfunction that needs to be rectified. So the values that I suppose in the last 20 years that my profession, psychiatry, has labored under has been very much determined by a certain, I suppose, fetishization of biology in mental health. And secondly, I think the influence of the market and to some degree public policy. It's much cheaper to put somebody on an antidepressant than provide them with appropriate psychological therapy. It's much cheaper to load a person with a schizophrenic illness up with lots of antipsychotics so they just quietly kind of while away their time and die 20 years earlier than provide them with appropriate rehabilitation, vocational support, appropriate living, all that sort of stuff. So these are, I think, these very nebulous influences on how medical values evolve at a societal level, but also at an institutional and professional level.
Yeah, I want to add to that because I think that this topic is actually, it's bigger than even what we're saying now. Because like what I noticed in my field in philosophy and ethics, after, I don't know if it started before, but definitely after we went from mental illness to brain disorders, you very rarely see a lot of work being done now in the mind-brain dichotomy or philosophy of mind. You know, a lot of stuff now you see in terms of neuroethics is really about neuroscience, not really about the ethical implications. No, it's about the ethical implications, but not how ethics and philosophy are looking at mind and mental cogitation. So I don't know if that's because medicine made a stand, got accepted in society, and then philosophers started questioning social assumptions. Or if it was just a reinforcement of that. But you see how these questions of going from biology to psychology, or how biolanguage infiltrates or permeates not only medicine and politics, but even fields such as philosophy.
I think, oh, sorry, go ahead, Stacy.
I think when you're talking about Emil Kraepelin and, you know, the way in which he really shifted the paradigm, he focuses on classification a lot. And then you see, again, Michael, when you're talking about the way in which psychiatry mirrors physical medicine. So physical medicine comes up with their magic bullet of penicillin to treat diseases. And then psychiatry decides, you know, they want to follow suit. And you see, you know, this boom in psychopharmacology and the rise in prominence that comes along with that. And I think, you know, the idea of when you can classify, and this goes back again to Foucault and a lot of the other things that we were talking about, once you can classify, then you can create a hierarchy, right? And so if you can classify and you can create a hierarchy, then you can put a value on where people in that hierarchy fall. And then you have the concept of medicalization. And then you have the concept of dehumanization. And then you have the concept of, Ira, what you were just saying now, biopower and how that plays in, and how using these biological concepts, using these concepts of medicalization, what that can do, people realizing what kind of a power that has and how that can unfortunately be abused. And so, first of all, I think we could have several webinars just on that topic alone. But what I do want to ask you, because this is actually something that we have received emails ahead of this program about this question, is, you know, we're talking about this and we're talking about how these things that took place during the Holocaust, Nazi medicine, what it can teach us about our current public health crises now. So, you know, we're talking about it right now within the field of psychiatry. The argument is often made that the Holocaust must be viewed as a unique event in history. I guess it's never okay to draw comparisons to the Nazis. So, the question is, are there lessons that we can learn? Are there things that we can take away from that time? Is it ever helpful to try and look to the Nazis when discussing current issues? What are kind of the benefits of doing so? What are the dangers of doing so?
So is that to me or to Ira?
Whoever wants to answer.
Well, I'll start. Look, as many people would be familiar with the trope of Godwin's law, which is essentially the longer that a conversation continues, the more likely the sort of Nazi example gets used. I suppose what that term's now come to mean is these facile comparisons between the Nazi regime and the current situation to score a rhetorical or emotive point. It is interesting that Mike Godwin, who termed this originally, did come out and say, well, no, if there's an actual comparison to be made, then make it. It shouldn't be just non-territory. It's a valid thing. But it's more about to try and make a sophisticated comparison, not to sort of own your opponent in an argument. And I think that's been the problem, because I think writing a book with Edwina, a bioethicist, and Astrid, a historian, this interdisciplinary work does try and sort of grapple with the meaning of the Nazi regime from different perspectives. Well, I think the way through this is to say, well, I suppose almost like by normative analogy, to say, well, let's put aside one's emotional responses to the Nazi regime and just assume that we have a Western culture that had, many similarities to the same cultures in the United States, in other European countries, in some of the evolving democracies in the New World. Consider that as being an example. They're not that different from us. And if you read, the diaries of Victor Klemperer, or you look at some of the stuff that's written, I don't think they were that different. Yet they were in a situation historically and economically and politically under extreme stress. And this is the kind of things that happen to Western culture or to modern states in those circumstances. So I think what we try and say is, well, let's look at, say, a modern culture with a modern apparatus of state under extreme political or economic pressure. How do they act? And what commonalities do we have with them, either professional values, cultural values, whatever you want to look at, and how does that apply to now? So the best example is to say, well, let's look at the question of reproductive rights. And we touch on this in the book in terms of prenatal genetic testing, and is that a form of contemporary eugenics? And we try not to land too much, because you then start integrating arguments about reproductive rights, and that's obviously very politically charged in different parts of the world. But to say, well, look, you can't just say that terminating a trisomy 21 pregnancy is the same thing as the murder of a child with a disability. But you can say, well, what are the values that determine those choices? How are we different as a culture? What are our safeguards? What are our cultural norms and mores? How do they differ from now, and how are they similar? And I think that's the sort of almost casuistry applied. It's almost that kind of form of saying, well, what's the paradigm? How far is the example from the paradigm? I think it is possible to make those kinds of comparisons. I know I took the scenic route with that answer, but that's where we got in the book, at least.
Yeah, this is going to be a hard question, because in one respect, I mean, Michael, you answered it great. It's hard for me, not for you. But in one respect, you don't want to always use the Holocaust for fear of minimizing the atrocity. In another way, you don't want to always refer to the Holocaust because you don't want to maximize or overemphasize anything that you're comparing the Holocaust to make it impossible to even talk about it. But once you do that, then you can't learn any lessons, right? So there has to be a way to recognize the uniqueness of the Holocaust while at the same time recognizing the commonalities. And I think this may be controversial to say, but I think one way to look at from a sociological perspective, not necessarily from an ethical perspective, is how much of some of the ways that we look at identity today is a reflection of the way identity was beginning to be described and shaped even in the Nazi period and beforehand. So I'll give an example, and this example is influenced by Paulo Freire's pedagogy of the oppressed, but you can see how it applies. If you look at the way the oppressors identified the oppressed people, and if oppressed people then adopt that identity in order to maintain their sense of self, they're actually reinforcing that oppressive nature even when they're trying to gain power, right? You see today, this is where it gets controversial, you see today that some of the ways that identity politics plays out, either in critical race theory or disability identity, that you look at people trying to take ownership of a categorization that was imposed upon them by oppressors. Now, they're doing that in order to regain and reassert power, but by doing that, they're creating an identity based on the same biological or racial discriminations that oppressors put upon them. So they're looking at a part of themselves and creating an identity, just like was done with the creation of disabilities and the creation of races from racism, right? So recognizing that, you could still say, yes, critical race theory and disability identity is important to recognize the victimization of certain groups. But if you are doing it at the expense of maintaining a discriminatory status quo, you may be gaining power at the expense of a long-term success. So that's the type of self-reflection and critical reflection that needs to be done of oppressed peoples when they are educating to remove themselves from their own oppression, that you could learn from history and you could learn from Weimar Germany and from the Nazification of medicine.
I wanted to just echo your point about the distinctness of the Holocaust, and we do wrestle with this in the second part of the book about where do you situate the Krankenmorde in the history of this. We asked the question: was our main character a survivor of the Holocaust? I won't sort of give away the ending, but we try and sort of take a view that this wasn't necessarily was the elimination or attempt the persecution of the sick and disabled a form of genocide. Had Lemkin written his definition now, would he have included disability as a category, which I think is assumed is the case, is that disability is as much a category as race or gender or sexuality. But can you argue that that is a form of genocide? So I think that there is this sort of challenge about the situation of the Holocaust, and also just the use of the term Holocaust, because it is appropriated by other groups in terms of Nazi victims. We hear about our gay Holocaust, we hear about other victim groups. I think Yad Vashem argues that they've almost jettisoned Holocaust as a concept and referred to Shoah being that aggregate of crimes against the Jewish people by the Nazi state and its affiliates. So there is that kind of issue about ownership of that historical period, and that buys into a very complicated political and cultural discussion that we're very aware of in the work we do at the Sydney Jewish Museum. We locate our bioethics work in that, but we're very aware that there is a distinction to the Holocaust and its uniqueness in Western culture, its uniqueness as a moment in Jewish history, its uniqueness in a moment in Western history, and that's a very delicate line to walk. And I think to fall back to say the ideas of say Zygmunt Bauman, who talks about, I suppose, almost like the Holocaust is all those things, but it also is this potential in modernity that lingers, and that ultimately is the sort of question. It's to say that we, and I think where we sort of land with the book is to say, well, if the Holocaust or the Shoah, shall we say, putting aside other groups like Porajmus and the Pink Triangle victims, if you say, look at the Shoah as injuncting us to identify and repudiate anti-Semitism and other forms of racism where we see it, citing that historical example, Krankenmorde and the crimes that we write about in the book should do the same thing in terms of ableism. That is to say, the subjugation or devaluing of people with different levels of ability. And I think when we look at our current situation, the disaster that we've seen in our country with aged care and most of the deaths, we've had about 900 deaths in Australia. It's obviously not, it's small beer compared to the Northern Hemisphere, and it's like one's heart bleeds for that at the moment, but most of our deaths have been in the aged care. And therefore there has a sector, and there has been this demonization of this group of people saying, why are we destroying our economy so that people get an extra couple of weeks of life at the end of their life? And that kind of ageist, and I dare I say ableist kind of trope sits in our mainstream media. It's coming from the political right, but it is something that seems to be legitimated in public discourse. And that is, I think, the kind of thing we have to take away from that Nazi period. The only other point I'd make is that, and I'm really speaking outside my lane here, but we look at an institution like the one I'm affiliated with the Sydney Jewish Museum, and I know there are multiple other institutions in North America facing the same question, is as the Holocaust moves inexorably away from living memory to, our last survivors won't be with us for much longer. How do we continue to interrogate the significance of that period? And a colleague of mine referred to the idea of a post-Holocaust institution, one that continues to represent, commemorate, and mourn the murdered Jews of Europe, but also to continue to examine the lessons broadly cast from that period. And I think that kind of double agenda is one that's going to be, I think, quite interesting for the next few decades. And I don't know if you want to speak to that, Ira, because that's where things are at in this very sort of inchoate stage at this point.
Yeah, no, I think it's a big problem. I think that if you look at least in the United States, memory of the Holocaust, what the Holocaust was, who it affects, why it matters, is diminishing to the point of zero. I mean, it's not at zero yet, but we're getting there. And I'm not saying that we always need to remember our history simply for the sake of history, but I do think that history is important to recognize, almost from a vicarious experience, how we could be better. And if we're just looking at the Holocaust from a nostalgia perspective or from a guilt and shame perspective, it's not going to serve its purpose, because we're just going to shrug off that guilt and shame, and we're not going to want to remember. I think it's important to remember how dark humanity could be, as well as the light of those who survived and those who fought, because it will serve great purposes to recognize both the dangers of losing civil society and politicizing power to the extent that we have, as well as the capability to get out of it. So having a post-Holocaust institution that remembers the past in order to protect our future, I think would be a fabulous idea.
I think that is a wonderful note to wrap up on, because I think really it gets to the point of exactly what it is that we wanted to talk about today, which is we can learn lessons from the past. Nazi medicine can teach us about our current public health crises. It can teach us a lot about things that we're dealing with now in terms of bioethics, public policy. If we don't remember the past, as Ira said, if we don't look back, if we don't reflect, if we don't learn from history, then we are really doing a disservice to ourselves, both in the present and also in the future. So with that being said, I want to thank very, very much all of you for being here, for taking the time to have this discussion. As I said, Dr. D'Souza, I know how many World Bioethics Day events you have participated in, and we are honored that you are here with us for the duration of this event. Dr. Robertson and Dr. Bedzow, thank you so much for this very informative conversation. As we said earlier, we are recording this event and we will make it available. Education is a really, really important aspect of what it is that we're talking about. So the more people we can reach, the better. I don't know if anyone has any final comments that they want to say. Dr. D'Souza?
Yeah, well, I quite enjoyed this, Michael. The concept of biopower. I think when you look at it, it has a lot of relevance to today. And I think what Stacy says, and what Ilza said, it's not about nostalgia, but I think the understanding of the how this happened and how it can happen again. because if you take what you just said about Leo Alexander, I have this. I quote his what he said at the end of the Nuremberg trials. That something so simple which people accept ended up in a different way, and I think this is important. And I think right now, this is very relevant. In fact, listening to Michael and Ira, I think we might like to have a webinar on from my perspective on this very important area, because I am seeing many countries are facing this issue, and you're talking about biopower. Many countries are facing this, and I think it makes a lot of sense and very important, very useful. And thank you very much for that. We should be looking at discussing and bringing this further with other colleagues, scholars who might have other views too. Looking at what you just spoke today, which it resonates with me. I identify with this. And Michael's your work. I'm a psychiatrist too, and certainly see what you spoke and what you said. The importance of you're talking about state, but there is also another arm, which is the market. The market, what we call the market, right? So there is that aspect that also has an influence on this power. So the biopower gets beyond just the state, because that's what I think, and in psychiatry, that's what you and I would agree with that in my own experience. So thank you very much, and congratulations on such an important topic and the depth in which this was discussed. Thank you.